The sharp clang of metal echoed harshly as the iron door slammed shut behind Damien Cross. The space was instantly consumed by the cold, sterile glare of fluorescent lights, just bright enough to see the bare concrete walls, just bright enough to watch his shadow dissolve on the floor beneath him. A prison officer, face expressionless, turned his back and walked away. Damien stood still, unmoving. He could hear the echo of his footsteps on the tile, hear the steady thump of his heartbeat, and louder than anything else, he could hear the past rising again. He had stepped into far more dangerous places than this. Fallujah, Kunduz, Kandahar. But nowhere had ever made him feel as suffocated as Fort Granger Federal Prison. Damien was once a captain commanding a Delta Force Pathfinder unit, an elite squad that operated deep behind enemy lines. He had led his soldiers across minefields, through Taliban checkpoints, and into terrorist hideouts buried in the Hindu Kush Mountains. On a 2014 mission, he had single-handedly pulled 3 wounded soldiers from a burning Humvee during an ambush. He received the Silver Star. But in the last newspaper that wrote about him, Damien Cross was labeled Federal Arms Trafficking Suspect. He said nothing as he passed through the control gates. Other inmates stared at him. Some whistled mockingly, others watched coldly. Damien betrayed no emotion. On the outside, he was stone, but in his mind, memories surged like crashing waves. He remembered the arrest, driving his daughter to school when the FBI forced his car off the road. The look of terror in 7-year-old Jasmine's eyes as she watched her father's face slammed onto the hood, handcuffed without a word. He remembered the agent's cold, mechanical gaze, as if programmed to believe he was already guilty. The court didn't take long. A fabricated file, anonymous witnesses, falsified documents from a tampered shipping container. Everything arranged as though some invisible hand was manipulating the entire system. Damien didn't cry, didn't yell, didn't beg for mercy. He looked the judge in the eye when the 15-year sentence was handed down and said only one thing. I served this country. Now, it treats me like a traitor. They called him defiant. But Damien knew that silence becomes the last weapon when the truth is twisted beyond recognition. He was assigned to G Block, where the most dangerous inmates were held. In this place, order was not kept by law, but by the law of the strong. Gangs like the Iron Fangs, the Red Vultures, and the Armenians controlled every corridor, every mealtime, and every phone booth. Newcomers who didn't bow their heads were tested. Damien placed his canvas bag on the bottom bunk of a cell so narrow that 2 men could barely lie sideways. His cellmate, an older man named Miguel, had silver hair and the rugged look of a former special ops soldier, now serving time for cross-border drug trafficking. Miguel looked him over and smirked. You're the soldier they framed, aren't you? Damien said nothing, but Miguel nodded, as if that was all the confirmation he needed. In here, truth doesn't matter. Only what people want to believe is true. That sentence echoed in Damien's head throughout the first night. He didn't sleep, not from fear, but from calculation, observation, mapping the patterns. Just like in war, where any strange sound might signal an ambush. On the 3rd day, a guard tossed a newspaper onto his bed. The front page headline screamed, War criminal Damien Cross incarcerated among high-risk offenders. Below it, a doctored photo showed him in uniform, edited clumsily to make him look cold-blooded. Damien flipped the page and stopped cold at the byline. Elliot Foster. Elliot. A name Damien could never forget. Foster had once been a principal military contractor and head of Haven Enterprises, a firm supplying weapons, gear, and logistics. Damien had clashed with him during an internal probe in Syria, after discovering an unmarked shipment of weapons that had mistakenly killed civilians in an airstrike. Damien filed a report. It vanished. The mission was canceled. His team pulled back, and months later, he was arrested. Was Foster connected to his conviction? On his 5th day, Damien was sent to the infirmary after a minor scuffle. There, he unexpectedly came face to face with someone familiar, Franklin Jones, a former combat medic from his unit. Jones now worked in the prison medical wing. They didn't acknowledge each other openly, but Jones's eyes flickered with concern. When the others left, he whispered, "I know you're innocent. I saw the edits in your medical file, part of the chain of tampered evidence. But I can't go public. Someone powerful is pulling all the strings in here." Damien clenched his fists, not out of fear, but because fury had begun to boil inside him. Yet his voice remained low and steady. "I don't need comfort. I need time." Jones nodded. "I'll signal you if something moves. But watch yourself. The Iron Fangs are watching. They don't like soldiers, especially not your kind." That night, Damien sat in the dark. In his mind was a map of the prison, gang leaders, phone line routes, staff patterns. More importantly, he began connecting the threads. Elliot Foster. Falsified medical reports, anonymous witnesses. All signs pointed to a bigger plan, a conspiracy in which he was just the scapegoat. He understood this was no longer just about him. This was part of a machine, a dark system that, if left standing, would keep crushing innocent lives like his. Like the thousands of forgotten veterans left discarded once they were no longer helpful. Damien Cross, the man who once crossed deserts under fire, who once stared death in the face in foreign lands, was now facing his most dangerous enemy yet, the indifference of justice. And this time, he had no unit behind him, no deployment orders, no helicopters waiting overhead, only himself and the darkness. The iron gate of Elridge Prison slammed shut behind Damien Cross with a deafening clang, as if his past had just been locked away with it. Gray walls swallowed the fading afternoon sun, and the air was thick with sweat, metal, and despair. Damien's step was shadowed by furtive glances from the cells, not out of curiosity, but as if each inmate were silently betting how long the new guy would last. He was assigned to Block D, the unit for inmates deemed dangerous but manageable, a paradox, much like the sentence he now carried. Damien said nothing. No one knew he had once commanded Squad 9 in Operation Black Ridge in Syria, that he had saved 7 lives with his own hands, or that he had once stood in open fire to pull a child from the rubble. Here in Elridge, all they saw was a silent killer, a black man with a solemn stare that didn't match the face once featured on the cover of a military magazine. The guard on duty that day was Vernon Miles, a middle-aged officer with a gaze cold as steel. He didn't care what a prisoner's name was, which cell they belonged in, whether they caused trouble, and most importantly, whether they followed the system. Vernon noticed something different in Damien's eyes. Not panic, not defiance, a strange calm, and he remembered it. On his first day in D-Block, Damien was searched down to every bone and scar. When the harsh medical light passed over his right arm, revealing a faded tattoo of the Special Forces insignia, a young guard asked, "You served?" Damien nodded. Not a word was spoken. Every step in Elridge was a warning. Gangs controlled each zone, the Iron Fangs, Black Aces, and Bloodhaven, each with their own rules, language, and enemies. Survival here wasn't about staying quiet. It was about knowing when to look away, when to bow your head, and when never to look back. Damien didn't follow the rules, but he didn't break them either. He became a quiet phantom, ate alone, trained alone, and even slept as if still in the deserts of Ramadi. That alone made him the subject of whispered rumors. Heard that one used to command Delta. Don't mess with him. Kills like it's nothing. Doesn't look like the show-off type. I don't buy the stories. The only one who dared approach Damien was Marcus Scrap Rains, a wiry black inmate with sharp eyes and a memory that forgot no face that passed through D-Block. Scrap wasn't a friend nor a foe. He cared only for information. And Damien was an untapped archive. "You're military, right?" Scrap asked one day while they lined up for food. Damien stayed silent. "Don't worry, I don't snitch. I know who's who in this place. And you? You're a secret no one's cracked yet." Damien still didn't reply. But that night, in the dim hallway light, he sat up in bed and cataloged every face, every hallway, every patrol cycle, even the way Vernon tapped his thigh when he was tired. Not habit, instinct. On the 10th day, Damien was blocked by 3 stocky men bearing wolf head tattoos, the mark of the iron fangs. They didn't speak. They stood in front of the workout yard door. It was a small act, but it was a declaration of war in prison. "Heard you used to command U.S. troops. Who are you serving now?" the leader murmured, his voice like sandpaper scraping metal. Damien glanced behind. There are no guards in sight, no cameras, no witnesses. He didn't answer, didn't back away. He just stood there, his eyes deep as a trench, unmoved. The second man stepped forward, ready to strike. But before the first punch could fall, Damien raised his head and spoke, low and clear. "I don't fight for turf. I fight when I know I'll survive." The line made all 3 pause, just a beat. Then one laughed mockingly. But at that exact moment, Vernon appeared. His eyes met Damien's for a fraction. Then he barked, "Break it up. That's enough." No one was sent to solitary that day, but from that moment, the prison's eyes and ears began watching Damien Cross more closely. In the darkness of Elridge, it's not the strongest who survive, but the least understood. Damien knew that, and he used it, not with violence, but by being still as stone amidst the chaos. He didn't need to prove anything. Elridge would test him on its own, through rumors, cheap shots, or a handshake laced with poison. But he didn't expect that his most significant test wouldn't come from shaved-head thugs or cruel guards. It came in an envelope, a plain white one. No name, no return address. Inside was a small piece of paper, a single, handwritten line. "I know you're innocent, and I know who did it. But if you want the truth, you'll have to pay for it." It was the beginning of another storm that wouldn't just change Elridge. It would change Damien himself. Elridge didn't feel like a prison at night. It felt like a breathing mausoleum. No sirens, no shouting, just the steady footsteps of guards in the hallways, the wheezing breath of an asthmatic inmate somewhere, and occasionally a soft knock on the wall, a sign of communication between adjacent cells. Damien sat on his metal bed. The white envelope in front of him felt like an unexploded mine. He read the line for the 7th time, then carefully folded it and tucked it into the slot of the cold heater. No one could see it, not out of fear, but because he needed to find out when exactly he had started being watched. The next day, he noticed something small in the exercise yard. The scrawny inmate who always sat on the far bench wasn't there. Instead, a new face occupied the spot. White, glasses, hourglass tattoo on the wrist, a mark of someone who had once run errands for the prison's underground networks. That wasn't a coincidence. Scrap appeared behind him, whispering, "Someone's feeding your info to the brass. Watch your back." "How do you know?" Damien asked for the first time. Scrap smirked. "Who do you think I am?" That night, Damien struck back. He began memorizing the prison's most minor quirks. Officer Bradley dozed off during night shifts. The maintenance door had a rusted lock that could be picked with a paperclip, and the camera in hallway C, leading to the records room, flickered whenever the backup generator kicked in. He didn't want to escape. He wasn't foolish. Damien needed one puzzle piece, a clue, from the system he believed had conspired to put him here. 3 nights later, he made his move. During a fake fire alarm, triggered by a coincidental milk carton fire in the kitchen, Damien slipped down to the old archive in the basement. He didn't have a key, but he had the hands of a man who once opened a Baghdad security vault with nothing but a razor blade. The door opened in 7 seconds. Inside, dusty filing cabinets, yellowed manila folders, and the scent of paper rot mixed with oxidized metal. Damien wasn't looking for medical reports or personal files. He searched for something else, a copy of his sentencing document, something that could name the judge who'd convicted him, a man he once saved in an ambush in Fallujah. Name, Harold Keene. Why would he? A man who once hugged Damien in the desert and said, "You're the reason I'm alive." Be the one to sign his imprisonment order for Elridge. As the fire alarm ended, Damien left the archive with papers tucked inside his shirt. No one saw him, but he knew. The person who sent the white envelope had seen everything. A week later, Damien received a book, Sun Tzu's The Art of War, delivered to his cell with no listed sender. Inside, on page 53, a handwritten note read, "If you want to know who the traitor is, look at the one who says the least." He thought of Franklin Jones. Jones, once a brother in arms, the man who had taken a bullet for him during a Korengal Valley mission, who had volunteered to work at Elridge not long after Damien's sentencing. He once believed Jones's presence was a blessing. Now it was a question. That night, Damien called out to Jones as he passed by. "Do you think I killed my fiancée?" he asked, cutting straight to the core. Jones paused, then slowly shook his head. "No, but I think you know who did, and you're not saying anything." "I can't." His voice cracked like splintered wood. 3 days later, Damien was transferred to the infirmary for persistent headaches, a claim filed by an anonymous inmate. There he was injected with a painkiller. But as he lay back, the scent was off, unfamiliar. His body started to go numb, his vision blurred. In the final moment before losing consciousness, he saw an unfamiliar face, white latex gloves, holding a backup syringe. "Sorry, Mr. Cross. You know too much." Darkness swallowed everything. He woke up in a white room. Not the infirmary, not solitary confinement. A nameless chamber with a two-way mirror. On the other side stood a woman in a black suit, eyes icy, studying him like a rogue experiment. She was Valerie Crane, Director of Internal Security for the Northridge State Prison System. And she knew that Damien Cross was the most significant threat the system had accidentally created. The white room had no windows, clock, or concept of time. Damien lay on a worn medical bed, his wrists shackled to the cold steel frame. The overhead light was blindingly bright, but not warm. His skin, still bruised, remained chilled. Across from him sat Valerie Crane, the woman in the black suit, short blonde hair, silver-rimmed glasses, and an expression that never changed. She was seated across the metal table. Next to her, a high-end audio recorder blinked red. "You're awake," she said coolly. "Good, we have a lot to talk about." Damien didn't respond. He glanced around the room. No visible cameras, but he was certain at least 3 were hidden in the ceiling corners, behind the mirror, and inside the ventilation grate. Valerie leaned forward, placing a thick folder on the table. His name was stamped on the cover, Damien Elijah Cross, and below it, in red letters, "Confidential. Not for distribution outside system." "Do you know why you're here?" "Because I survived," Damien said hoarsely. "And Blaze didn't." Valerie raised a brow slightly. "No, Damien. You're here. Because you remember." 3 hours later, they were still there. It wasn't an interrogation between prisoner and administrator. It was a standoff between buried truth and the one man who refused to let it stay buried. Valerie didn't ask about his charges. She asked about other things, about the mission in Kandahar in 2013, where Damien had rescued a kidnapped CIA colonel, about his late fiancée, Leah, who had worked for a nonprofit law organization investigating corruption in prison systems, about how Leah had uncovered a money laundering ring connected to Haven Enterprises, a company tied to Elliot Foster, a close friend of the state's governor, and then about her sudden death, staged as a violent carjacking. "You think you were framed just because of her?" Valerie asked. Damien stared into her eyes. "No, I was framed because she knew too much." Valerie nodded like he'd just passed an exam. "You're still alive for one reason. The system wants to see if you're smart enough to stay quiet." Damien scoffed. "So you're saying, if I keep my mouth shut, I get to live?" Valerie leaned back in her chair. "No. I'm saying, if you keep talking, more people will die." Damien was returned to his cell that night, or rather, that morning. He didn't know how long he'd been held. He knew that when he returned, Scrap was no longer in his bunk. A smear of dried blood on the floor, and a hollow stare from the inmate next door. No one said anything. Damien understood. Scrap had known too much, and now no one knew where he was. Damien quietly removed his prison shirt, hiding the swelling injection marks on his arm. His mind swarmed with 100 fragments. Leah, the newsroom where she once worked, the voicemail she had left on an old phone, a recording he listened to once and deleted, afraid someone else would find it. Her voice still echoed in his head. "If I disappear, Dee, don't chase justice. Find the truth, because justice is what they print on paper. But truth, it's carved into people's bones." A week later, Franklin Jones returned to his post. His eyes were sunken, his voice rougher, his walk slower. Damien knew. He had been in the White Room too. And unlike Damien, Jones had chosen silence. Jones handed Damien a folded note during dinner service, so quickly no one noticed. Inside was a blurry black and white photo captured from a hidden camera. In the photo were Foster, Valerie Crane, and Harold Keene, the judge who sentenced Damien, seated together in a secret meeting room. On the table was a red folder, precisely like the one Valerie had shown him. On the back of the photo, one handwritten line: "If you want to live, don't let them think you're just a soldier." That line haunted Damien all night. He couldn't sleep, not from fear, but because he now understood that he wasn't just a prisoner. He was the last living witness of a high-level conspiracy, and every second was now a game of survival versus revelation. He stood before the cell mirror and stared into his own eyes, no longer filled with rage or doubt. Only one thing remained: purpose. He whispered, "Yeah, I won't cry anymore. I won't apologize. I won't forgive." And in that moment, Damien Cross, the betrayed soldier, became the greatest threat to a rotting system. A night of rain, not just dripping from the rusted ceiling, but real rain. Damien sat in the corner of his cell, eyes fixed on each drop sliding down the iron bars, as if each carried a secret he hadn't yet unraveled. Outside the prison, something more dangerous than captivity was unfolding. Jessica Green, Leah's best friend and former colleague, had just released a brief news segment on an independent outlet, a thin thread of a story, but sharp enough to cut through the shell of lies. On screen, she didn't mention Damien's name. She didn't say Leah's either. She said, "We have evidence that certain high-level individuals manipulated the election results for the state prison director. We are pursuing additional documentation, and when the time comes, we will release it." Just a few lines. But behind the bars, Damien understood. Jessica was sending a signal. She didn't need to say his name. She just needed him to hear. The next morning, a new inmate arrived at G Block, maximum isolation. a man known as Corkscrew, a former bodyguard for a Tampa drug cartel, imprisoned for orchestrating murders inside prison. Brutal, unprincipled, and, most importantly, loyal to whoever paid the most. As he passed Damien's cell, Corkscrew glanced sideways and smirked. "So you're the famous Purple Heart. Heard you killed 3 men just to save 1. Wish I'd seen it myself." Damien didn't respond, but Corkscrew knew how to shatter silence. A day later, he assaulted a white inmate in the showers. Not over conflict, but to bait Damien. When guards arrived, he pointed and said, "Cross told me to." Damien was hauled to disciplinary again. This time, Valerie didn't show. Instead, a bald, pale man in a gray dress shirt entered, introducing himself as Harold Keene, a retired judge, though still wielding more power than most sitting politicians. He walked in and sat down like the prison was his living room. "You're breaking the silence pact, Damien," he said flatly. "We never had a pact," Damien replied. "Exactly. And that's why you won't have much time to invent one." 3 days later, Damien's cell was raided. Books were torn, pillows were slashed, and a flash drive was confiscated. The one with the photo Franklin had given him. Franklin was suspended. No one knew where he went. Rumors spread fast. Jones was transferred. But Damien knew that in this system, transferred meant disappeared. He stood in his now bare cell, back turned to the camera. There was no fear left in him, only a single question. How many more have to die before the world listens? During inmate recreation, a stranger sat near him that evening. Tattooed arms, gray clouded eyes. Without turning, the man slipped a small folded note into Damien's hand, stood up and walked away. Damien opened it. The scrawled message. She left a copy in the old data vault code, L311YAH. If you've got the courage, meet me at the records floor Friday night. No signature. But Damien knew. Someone out there was still fighting for Laya. In the following days, Damien made a plan. No fights, no riots, just what the system feared most. A man with nothing left to lose, but too much truth to hold back. He started talking to invisible inmates, the ones the system didn't bother to track. A framed accountant, a young hacker who breached the police database, a woman who pretended to be mentally ill for 3 years to gather internal intel. Damien connected them, not through promises, but through shared pain. "They don't lock us up for our crimes," he told them one foggy morning. "They lock us up because we know how to unmask theirs." Friday night, Damien was escorted to the records storage wing. Most guards had been redeployed. Officially, it was a routine audit. But he knew. It was the beginning of a quiet rebellion. A small USB drive passed from the stranger's palm to Damien's in the dusty old room among rows of rusted metal cabinets. "She encoded it with her voice," the man whispered. "Only someone who lived with her can decrypt it." Damien gripped the USB tight. Etched on its casing was a single line. "We are the storm, not the silence." That night, Damien didn't sleep. He sat with his back against the wall, dim light from the hallway casting a faint glow across the stained cement floor. In his hand was the small USB drive, the only remaining piece of Laya, the woman who had fought to the very end to protect the truth. He held the device close to his ear. No sound, no signal. But he knew. Her voice was inside, just waiting for the right person to speak again. The next morning, Damien received word from a new guard that he was being transferred to the temporary technical labor unit. The reason listed in his file was evaluation of rehabilitation potential. He knew this was no coincidence. This was a signal from Valerie Baines, the inmate supervisor, playing both sides of the system. The tech unit was a brick building isolated from the rest, where prisoners were typically assigned broken electronics to repair or sort before disposal. But Damien wasn't interested in charred circuit boards. He needed a computer old enough to avoid surveillance, but still good enough to read the encrypted USB. 3 days later, he found it. An old Dell is discolored and discarded at the bottom of a tech waste bin. Damien discreetly removed it, removed its casing, and hid the motherboard inside the padding of a broken seat in the rest area. When the unit was quiet at night, he hooked it up to a power adapter, just enough to run the screen for 3 minutes. 3 minutes. To decode the voice of the woman who gave her life for justice. The screen flickered, keys clicked, and then her voice came alive. If you're hearing this, Damien, it means I'm no longer here. He clenched his fist. They took everything. Evidence, witnesses, even me. But I backed up everything. Internal reports, payment ledgers, lists of illegal transfers by Haven Enterprises. And the audio recording I have kept for 2 years. The screen dimmed. The remaining data was in an encrypted file, which required Damien's voice to unlock it. He looked around, then spoke a private code they once shared. Echo Delta 01, run Blackstar Protocol. An audio file played, a man's voice, aging, smug. It was Elliot Foster, CEO of Haven Enterprises. No one cares about discharged soldiers. They're tools. When they're used up, toss them. She thought she could investigate me. Let her disappear. Everyone has a price. Damien froze. His eyes locked on the screen. Those sounds were the hell she had endured, the final wound she took for him. The next day, he wrote a small note hidden beneath a loose floor tile. To Jessica, there's an audio file. We need to meet in person. Urgent. Franklin Jones, the guard once his comrade, reappeared like a quiet breeze. No uniform, sunken eyes, but still the same man, the one who never left Damien, even as the system tried to erase him. I can get the message out, Franklin said, but you need to be ready. If this leaks before it reaches her, they'll kill you. Damien nodded. Then let's move fast before they catch on. 3 days later, the prison buzzed with tension. Word spread. An audio recording had leaked, broadcast on an independent platform, run by Jessica Green. In the recording, Elliot Foster, head of Haven, was heard admitting to using the Reclaim Futures charity fund as a front for laundering money through forced labor contracts in correctional camps. It was the network that turned Damien into a pawn and got Laya killed. That same day, a federal judicial inspection team arrived for an unannounced prison audit. Prisoners said nothing, but their eyes began to gleam. Damien was summoned to the monitoring room. Valerie met him with a cold stare, but the control in her eyes was gone. At the center of the room, a screen played the news broadcast. An official investigation has been launched into Haven Enterprises. CEO Elliot Foster declined to comment. Valerie whispered, "You've stirred up a storm, and that storm is taking me with it." Damien looked at her. "No, you chose to walk into it." She didn't deny it. "We've been silent too long," she murmured. "Now, you need to stay alive to tell the rest." That night, Damien's cell was raided. But it wasn't an arrest. It was a hit. 4 unknown men, no insignia, gloves on, no words. But Damien was ready. Like a soldier with nothing left to lose, he fought. Not to win, but to buy time. The alarm blared. Franklin emerged from the north hallway, holding a clearance card and an old Glock. "Run! There's a way out through the basement," he shouted. Damien stepped back. Blood trickled from his shoulder, but his eyes burned with the fire of a final battle. He looked at Franklin. "No, we don't run. We expose them." Franklin nodded. "Then we start tonight." Rain poured down in torrents onto the rusted tin roof of the old warehouse behind the temporary technical detention area. Inside, Damien sat silently, one shoulder hastily bandaged, blood still seeping through the worn prison shirt. Franklin, his comrade from Basra, now the guardian of the innocent, was taping it over the surveillance cameras. Every action was precise and cold, as if they had returned to the battlefield. "We have less than 8 hours before the special response team is deployed," Franklin said, laying down a blueprint of the old ventilation tunnel system that had been sealed since 2012. "We don't need to run," Damien replied, his voice hoarse. "We need to leave them with nothing to hide." He pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket. A list of names of those who had worked with Foster. Judges, prison wardens, officials who had accidentally overlooked Laya's reports, and one particular individual. Warden Carlisle, the current director of the prison. Carlisle was a shadow in the dark, always avoiding the media, never speaking, never meeting the press. But Damien knew. He kept the entire people-devouring machine named Haven Correctional Initiative running. "We need to make him appear," Damien said. Franklin frowned. "How?" Damien clenched the USB he had hidden for the past week. "I'll leave him nowhere to hide." 3 hours later, in the internal broadcast system's technical room, Franklin picked the lock on the control panel. Damien plugged the device into the central audio port. He took a deep breath, then played the recording of Foster admitting the truth. Those who were on the battlefield, they're just old tools, easy to control, dispose of any who rebel. The sound echoed throughout the prison. Inmates looked up. Some were stunned. Some beat their chests and shouted. But all understood. Someone had risked everything to say what no one dared to. Immediately, the alarm blared. Prison-wide order. Emergency. All inmates must return to their cells immediately. At the same time, Warden Carlisle smashed his coffee cup in the main office. "Bring Cross here immediately," he roared at the 2 accompanying officers. But it was too late. Damien was coming to him. Franklin and Damien navigated through side corridors, weaving through the kitchen area and up the service stairs. Each step was not to escape, but to enter the lair. When they reached the executive office, 2 guards stood blocking the door. Franklin signaled. Damien stepped forward, head held high, eyes unwavering. "I'm here to talk," he said. The guards looked at each other, confused. A whistle blew, and the door opened. Inside, Carlisle stood up, slamming his hand on the desk. "What do you think you're doing, Cross? I could have you shot right here." Damien didn't respond immediately. He placed the USB on the desk. "In there is a copy of the data Foster gave you. Signed orders, dirty money, and the report she, the only woman brave enough, handed to you 3 days before she was killed." Carlisle turned pale. Damien stepped forward, each step pressing down on years of betrayal. "You think I survived just to leave this place? No. I lived to prove she was right. That this system, you all, have twisted the concept of justice beyond recognition." Carlisle reached for his gun, but Franklin was already behind him, Glock aimed directly. "No one shoots today," Franklin said. Carlisle gasped, retreating to his chair. "What do you want?" Damien looked him straight in the eye. "I want you to say it. On camera. That she, Laya Green, didn't commit suicide. That you were ordered to silence her." Carlisle shook his head. "I didn't." Damien pulled from his pocket a video recording. Footage of Foster and Carlisle, talking in a private office, captured by a device Laya had hidden in her collar one last time. Foster's voice rang out. "She knows too much. Take care of it. You're paid to clean up the mess." Carlisle was speechless. "You can't," he stammered. Damien turned on the camera. "I can, and I will." An hour later, the entire video of Carlisle's confession was broadcast on Jessica Green's social media account, now followed by millions. On the screen, people everywhere saw a trembling prison warden admitting his crimes, naming involved officials, and ending with a haunting statement. "We never thought anyone would stand against us. That was our mistake." Meanwhile, in the prison's media office, an urgent fax was sent. Arrest warrant for CEO Elliot Foster. Suspension of all Haven Enterprises operations. Initiate a criminal investigation into Warden Carlisle and the prison board. Valerie received the notification, her eyes fixed on the screen, displaying Damien's disseminated video. "You've truly changed everything," she whispered. That evening, the inmates were gathered in the yard. No shouting, no resistance, just silence. But unlike before. Damien stood among them, unshackled. Franklin stood beside him. Valerie watched from afar, knowing that he was no longer a prisoner at this moment. He was a witness, a catalyst. No alarms blared. No guards' footsteps echoed. Only an eerie stillness enveloped Haven Correctional Facility, as if the entire place held its breath, awaiting an end or a beginning. Damien Cross sat alone in the VIP holding cell, once reserved for cooperative inmates. But this time, no deal was on the table. He was no longer someone to negotiate with. He was the one who changed the rules of the game. Dim light from the small window reflected off his face. Resolute, yet weary. Years of fighting, not just against invisible enemies on the battlefield, but against those wearing the mask of justice. And now, with all exposed, Damien felt no victory, only the void left by those who were gone. Laya Green, Lieutenant Donovan, and countless unnamed others buried under system errors. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., during an extraordinary hearing at the Federal Judiciary Committee, the video of Warden Carlisle's confession was played. The entire chamber fell silent. A senator stood up, face flushed. "You're telling me a private organization can manipulate federal law, imprison anyone, even veterans, just because they threaten profits?" Special Counsel Valerie Monroe, representing Damien, responded succinctly, "Not can, they did, and now they've been exposed." Back at Haven, Damien was taken from solitary for interrogation and court. Media surrounded the armored vehicle transporting him. Cameras focused on the determined face of a man once labeled a dangerous murderer. But today, people saw a warrior who refused to surrender, a living symbol. Outside the courthouse, a small group of veterans held signs. "Justice for Damien." Laya didn't die in vain. Shut down Haven Enterprises. In the courtroom, federal judge Clarissa Vaughn, renowned for her integrity and firmness, read Damien's file. She paused at the final line. "Insufficient evidence for conviction. The case shows signs of systemic manipulation. Recommend dismissal of all charges." The room fell silent. Clarissa looked up at Damien. "Mr. Cross, would you like to speak before I officially pronounce the verdict?" Damien looked around, at the reporters, the veterans, the people who had never known him, but now placed their trust in a man once framed as a criminal. He stood, voice steady and warm. "I'm not here to vindicate myself. I'm here for those who never had this chance. Those we've lost, like Laya. Those left behind, like my mother, waiting at home for an explanation that never came. I don't need pity. I need a promise that we won't let this happen to anyone else." The trial concluded. Damien was acquitted, but instead of leaving, he requested to see someone, his mother. At a small house at the end of a street in Kansas City, Gloria Cross, over 70, opened the door as a black car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out slowly, her eyes no longer as bright as before. But when she saw Damien, they lit up, not with joy, but with something every mother feels. Her child is alive, still a good man. "I'm sorry for making you wait so long," Damien said, kneeling to embrace her. "You don't need to apologize," she whispered. "Just come home." After returning home, Damien didn't hide. He didn't leave the country. He didn't shirk responsibility. On the contrary, he accepted an invitation from a prestigious law school, where he spoke about the underlying structures of private prison contracts, how data was falsified, confessions coerced, witnesses silenced, and above all, the silence that killed justice. In a lecture to first-year law students, he stood at the old wooden podium, looked into the innocent eyes before him, and said, "When a system becomes too powerful, the weakest voices need amplification. If you don't amplify them, you stand with the oppressor." No applause followed, only silence, heavier than any praise. At the same time, CEO Elliot Foster was prosecuted on 14 federal charges. He appeared before the public no longer as a powerful businessman, but as a symbol of greed, abuse of power, and the decay of privatized justice. He remained silent when reporters asked, "Do you regret it?" He only said, "I thought I was the smartest person in the room." No one disagreed, because now the nation knew the most intelligent person wasn't the one who manipulated the system, but the one who dared to stand before it and say, "I will be silent no more." Morning in Kansas City passed slowly, shrouded in mist, as if the sky was contemplating itself. Damien Cross stood before a black stone slab, engraved with the name Leah Green, 1987-2024. She did not remain silent. He placed a bouquet of white chrysanthemums on the cold stone, bowing his head, not in sorrow, but reverence. Beside him stood Gloria, his mother, silently holding her son's hand. "I owe her the truth," Damien murmured, as if speaking to himself. "She didn't die out of curiosity. She died because she believed that justice could protect the innocent." "And you're proving she was right," Gloria replied, her voice steady like the earth. That day, Damien set out for Atlanta to attend a special event, a public hearing organized by the Special Committee on Private Justice. He wasn't alone. Alongside him was a unique group: former inmates of Haven, individuals wrongfully accused, and families of those who had died in custody. In the auditorium, a hand was raised. "Mr. Cross, if you had the chance to speak to all of America about what happened in just one sentence, what would you say?" Damien stood, slowly walked to the podium, and spoke in a deep, steady voice. "Not all prisoners are guilty, and not all free people are innocent." Damien's statement was broadcast live. Millions watched via television, social media, and alternative media platforms. In Chicago, a young black teenager recently detained for 7 days for failing to prove identity stared at the screen as if finding something, a reason to stand tall. In a small law office in Baltimore, Jessica Green, Leah's sister, paused before the screen, biting her lip. She had resigned from her previous firm and was now applying to the Institute for People's Justice. Her eyes sparkled. "Sister, we haven't lost." Damien received hundreds of letters, not from celebrities or politicians, but from society's invisible people. A mother who lost her child in prison, a wife deceived by the system, and a veteran denied benefits due to a clerical error. In one handwritten letter with scrawled handwriting, "I've never believed in the law, but seeing you, I believe. Maybe, just maybe, justice isn't dead." Damien read each word unhurriedly, without skipping a line. He didn't reply to all, but each story left a mark on him, like silent blades cutting into his memory, compelling him not to stop. Meanwhile, the Independent Council for Private Prison Oversight was officially launched in New York, a milestone event. Council Chair Judge Clarissa Vaughn declared, "From today, any contract with private prison organizations must be public, monitored, and subject to cancellation if human rights violations are found. We cannot allow an opaque system to decide who is imprisoned and who is not." Damien Cross's name wasn't mentioned in the speech, but everyone knew. Without him, that council wouldn't exist. That evening, in a quiet bar in D.C., Damien sat with an old acquaintance, Franklin Jones, the only guard who had risked his life to help him. Having left Haven, Jones worked as a security guard at a community center. He clinked glasses with Damien, smiling. "You know, there was a time I thought I was the most cowardly. Knowing it was wrong, I was still standing by. But now I think, at least I didn't let it continue." Damien nodded, then looked out the window. The greatest cowardice isn't silence. It's continuing to serve the wrong after knowing what it is. They clinked glasses again, saying nothing more. The night was silent, but within that silence was a promise that everyone who once stood in the shadows could choose to step into the light. At the end of Part 9, a quiet scene, Damien alone returned to Arlington Cemetery. He placed his hand on the tombstone of an old comrade, Donovan Tran, who once called him the most stubborn guy in Delta Force. He didn't cry. He whispered, "Rest in peace. As for me, I still have work to do." The wind blew gently, leaves fell, and Damien's figure gradually disappeared behind the trees, embarking on a new journey. This time not to save himself, but to save the unheard souls. Night fell over Washington, D.C., but the lights still burned brightly inside a high-rise building on K Street. On the 27th floor, in the conference room of the law firm Beaumont and Wessler, 3 men in black suits were reviewing a video. On the screen, Damien Cross was speaking. "Not all prisoners are guilty, and not all the free are innocent." One of the 3 men, Arthur Kent, Director of Communications for the Autonomous Private Alliance, APA, took a drag from his cigarette. "This guy can't be allowed to keep going. If he survives the media storm, the entire private prison model will collapse before December." The second man, Senator Briggs, lowered his head in agreement. "We need a story, a scandal, something that will make the public stop seeing Damien as the innocent hero." The third man, a senior attorney at Haven Enterprises, smirked. "Leave it to me. We already have his mother's psychological records. She was once hospitalized for depression. We need to leak a few files and raise questions about hereditary influence, and the public will start to doubt. From there, we plant the seed." They clinked glasses. There was no intoxication in those dark glasses of liquor, only the scent of power and lies. A few days later, Damien received a message from an old friend in journalism. "They're going after your mother, fabricating stories from her old medical records, blowing them up into a narrative about hereditary psychological risk. You need to be ready." Damien sighed and picked up the phone to call home, but his mother's voice on the other end was calm. "Don't worry about me, son. I've survived war, prejudice, and the loss of a child. A few newspapers won't kill me." "Mom, this time, they don't just want to kill you. They want to kill the truth." "I know, but if it's strong enough, the truth doesn't need protection." The next morning, headlines exploded across the media. "Hero or inherited madness. Damien Cross and his family's buried past." Talk shows rolled out expert analysis, citing old records of his mother and speculating whether war trauma syndrome might have affected Damien. Worse, a spliced video from an old interrogation, in which Damien shouted in a moment of stress, was replayed constantly, used as supposed evidence of mental instability. Damien did not respond. He did not sue. He did not speak out on television. Instead, he headed to Jackson, Mississippi, where another prison was under investigation after 7 mysterious deaths over 2 years. He entered the community, met with the victims' families, and listened. No cameras, no press, no statements. There, a father who had lost his son in prison asked him, "They're hitting you in the face, and you don't hit back. Why?" Damien looked into the man's eyes and said quietly, Because I want people to see who's doing the hitting. One night, Damien received a call from Judge Vaughn, chair of the Oversight Council. Damien, I'll be blunt. I'm under pressure. Some donors have pulled out. I've been warned that I might be investigated personally if I continue to keep you as an independent advisor. So you're stepping down? No, but I want you to know. I won't be able to protect you if things go too far. Damien only gave a faint smile. You don't need to protect me. Just don't forget why you started. That night, Damien returned home. His mother, Gloria, was knitting. On the table lay a letter with no return address. Inside, just one sentence. We know where your mother lives. Stay silent for your son's safety. Damien clenched the paper, his gaze turning cold as steel. He turned to his mother. Mom, if I back off, they'll stop. I didn't raise you to run. I raised you to stand, even if it means walking through hell. Damien nodded. Then he sat down at the table and opened his laptop. He began to write, not a speech, but an investigation file. 1 week later, Damien held a press conference at the modest headquarters of the New Path organization. There were no TV cameras, only people who had lost loved ones, been wrongfully convicted, or stayed silent for too long. Damien took the mic, his voice steady and firm. They once imprisoned me. Then they slandered me. Then they attacked my mother. Then they threatened to kill me. But I'm still here. Because I don't fight for fame. I fight because if I don't, then who will? That press conference lasted only 18 minutes. But those 18 minutes were shared millions of times on social media. Not by primary news channels, but by ordinary people. Students, teachers, single mothers, former inmates. At the same time, a group of independent journalists released evidence showing that Haven Enterprises had manipulated the media, bribed doctors, and falsified medical records, all to smear Damien and his mother. Outrage exploded. Some major news networks were forced to issue public apologies. Several communications directors resigned. Arthur Kent came under investigation. Though he denied everything, Senator Briggs was forced to drop out of his re-election campaign. At the law office of Jessica Green, the younger sister of the late journalist Leah Green, she raised a coffee cup and smiled. Damien didn't fight back with blood. He fought back with truth. And this time the blood belongs to those who thought they were untouchable. The Marblegate Building, a towering steel and glass structure in the heart of Washington, symbolized power and victory. And tonight, Damien Cross had been invited to its top floor. No press, no public statement. It was just a private exchange between Damien and Charles Wexler, the National Security Advisor, the man rumored to have manipulated much of the private prison system over the past 2 decades. Damien wore a black shirt and carried no documents. He entered the meeting room, where Charles was already waiting with 2 glasses of whiskey. I heard you don't drink. Charles smiled. So, I'll drink for the both of us. Damien sat down, his gaze steady as stone. You called me here to apologize? Charles laughed heartily and shook his head. No, Damien. I called you here to make an offer. Damien didn't respond. He crossed his arms and waited. We're facing a crisis. The private prison system is teetering. APA is fracturing. Investors are pulling out. The left treats you like Moses, and even the right is beginning to waver. But I'm not here to fight. I'm here to negotiate. Damien raised an eyebrow. And what do you want? Charles leaned forward, his voice slow and deliberate. I want you to take the position of White House advisor on prison reform, a salary of $280,000, a private office, a team of assistants. You'll have authority over internal oversight and lead reform initiatives within the limits we define. Damien stayed silent, not because he was surprised, but because it was all too predictable. In return, Charles continued, you will no longer speak publicly about Haven Enterprises. You will not dig into old contracts. and under no circumstances will you interfere with APA's labor-based rehabilitation model. Damien closed his eyes and took a deep breath. You can still help people, but from the inside, and stay alive. Silence. Then Damien answered slowly. When I was in prison, a guard once told me, you can make your life easier. Just stop causing trouble. Now I realize there's no such thing as comfort inside a gilded cage. Charles leaned back and changed his tone. Don't be foolish, Damien. Who do you think you are? Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King. They compromised too, to stay alive. Damien stood up. His eyes were no longer filled with anger, but sorrow. I don't need a long life. I need a righteous one. And he walked out of the room, leaving behind an untouched glass of whiskey and a system that had just lost its final chance to tame a conscience. That night, Damien didn't return home. He went to the slums that had long been a gray zone, where former inmates couldn't find work, where children feared police more than ghosts. There, a man named Reggie, who had served 14 years for a crime he didn't commit, was teaching young students math. Damien quietly sat at the back of the class. When the class ended, Reggie was surprised. Damien? What are you doing here? To remember who I'm fighting for. The next day, Damien posted on social media, I turned down a position at the White House because I don't want to be a name within the system. I want to be a crack. And through the crack, the light can come in. The community erupted. A peaceful protest spread from D.C. to Chicago, New York, and Oakland. Former inmates, families of victims, law students, pastors, and war veterans all raised the same banner. Justice is not for sale. In an online discussion, a female student asked Damien, Aren't you afraid? They could do anything to silence you. Damien looked straight into the camera without hesitation. Of course I'm afraid. But I'm more afraid of one thing, that my child will grow up in a world where truth is defined by money. Meanwhile, at the White House, Charles Wexler loosened his collar and threw Damien Cross's file onto the table. An aide asked, What now, sir? Charles answered in a low voice, We can't control him, but we can wear him down. The Marblegate Building, a towering steel and glass structure in the heart of Washington, symbolized power and victory. And tonight, Damien Cross had been invited to its top floor. No press, no public statement. It was just a private exchange between Damien and Charles Wexler, the National Security Advisor, the man rumored to have manipulated much of the private prison system over the past 2 decades. Damien wore a black shirt and carried no documents. He entered the meeting room, where Charles was already waiting with 2 glasses of whiskey. I heard you don't drink. Charles smiled. So, I'll drink for the both of us. Damien sat down, his gaze steady as stone. You called me here to apologize? Charles laughed heartily and shook his head. No, Damien. I called you here to make an offer. Damien didn't respond. He crossed his arms and waited. We're facing a crisis. The private prison system is teetering. APA is fracturing. Investors are pulling out. The left treats you like Moses, and even the right is beginning to waver. But I'm not here to fight. I'm here to negotiate. Damien raised an eyebrow. And what do you want? Charles leaned forward, his voice slow and deliberate. I want you to take the position of White House advisor on prison reform, a salary of $280,000, a private office, a team of assistants. You'll have authority over internal oversight and lead reform initiatives within the limits we define. Damien stayed silent, not because he was surprised, but because it was all too predictable. In return, Charles continued, you will no longer speak publicly about Haven Enterprises. You will not dig into old contracts, and under no circumstances will you interfere with APA's labor-based rehabilitation model. Damien closed his eyes and took a deep breath. You can still help people, but from the inside, and stay alive. Silence. Then Damien answered slowly. When I was in prison, a guard once told me, you can make your life easier. Just stop causing trouble. Now I realize there's no such thing as comfort inside a gilded cage. Charles leaned back and changed his tone. Don't be foolish, Damien. Who do you think you are? Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King. They compromised too, to stay alive. Damien stood up. His eyes were no longer filled with anger, but sorrow. I don't need a long life. I need a righteous one. And he walked out of the room, leaving behind an untouched glass of whiskey and a system that had just lost its final chance to tame a conscience. That night, Damien didn't return home. He went to the slums that had long been a gray zone, where former inmates couldn't find work, where children feared police more than ghosts. There, a man named Reggie, who had served 14 years for a crime he didn't commit, was teaching young students math. Damien quietly sat at the back of the class. When the class ended, Reggie was surprised. Damien? What are you doing here? To remember who I'm fighting for. The next day, Damien posted on social media, I turned down a position at the White House because I don't want to be a name within the system. I want to be a crack. And through the crack, the light can come in. The community erupted. A peaceful protest spread from D.C. to Chicago, New York, and Oakland. Former inmates, families of victims, law students, pastors, and war veterans all raised the same banner. Justice is not for sale. In an online discussion, a female student asked Damien, aren't you afraid? They could do anything to silence you. Damien looked straight into the camera without hesitation. Of course I'm afraid. But I'm more afraid of one thing, that my child will grow up in a world where truth is defined by money. Meanwhile, at the White House, Charles Wexler loosened his collar and threw Damien Cross's file onto the table. An aide asked, What now, sir? Charles answered in a low voice, We can't control him, but we can wear him down.